So previously in class, we've been talking about natural selection and evolution, and I'd just like to remind you that the word evolution is just the cumulative changes in a group of organisms throughout time. So today we're going to talk about the evidence that we have that evolution is going on. And in section 15.2, we're going to be looking at how fossils provide evidence of evolution, how morphological evidence provides us an idea that evolution is going on, and how physiology and biochemistry provide evidence of evolution. So let's start by going through the 5 different ways that we can support evolution. The first one is the fossil record. Now, the fossil record gives us a clue to what ancient organisms look like. We can use that fossil record to compare organisms that we see today and who their ancestors were. And it does show us a link to see that change over time. As we discover more fossils, we can start to see different adaptations, different skeletal structures that actually change over time. So here we have the Archaeopteryx, and it is a dinosaur, but it actually shares many features with modern birds, such as the legs, the feathers, the beak-like structure. So all of those provide evidence that evolution has occurred. Now, when we're looking at traits through the fossil record, we have something called derived traits and we have ancestral traits. Now, derived traits are new features that have showed up, such as feathers, that we don't see in fossils of common ancestors. Ancestral traits, on the other hand, are things like teeth, tails that do appear. And then the transitional is as we see those starting to show up. So while we're looking at the fossil records, we want to see traits that are derived, they've just showed up in the fossil record, or ancestral traits, things that have been around for a really long time. The second piece of evidence that we have is comparative anatomy. And comparative anatomy lets us look at the skeletal structure between different organisms, and it lets us see, was there a link? Is there not a link? And when we're looking at comparative anatomy, we actually have a couple of new vocab words. The first thing are homologous structures. Now, homologous structures are structures on different organisms that have a similar structure and or function. Homologous structures are evidence that we had a common ancestor. So if we want to look at the 4 arms of, in this case, we have humans, cats, whales, and bats, and we see some structures that are very identical to each other. We have a humerus up at the top. We have a radius on one side with the ulna on the other side. We can see that in the cat. Here's their radius, here's their ulna. We see it in a whale, we see it in a bat. Then we down here we have our wrists, which are their carpals. We see those bones in every organism. And then we have our phalanges, or our fingers. Now, the structure themselves look different, where, like our lower arm is a little bit longer than a whale's lower arm, and they have obviously quite a bit more phalanges than we have phalanges. But we see the same. We have 1 bone to 2 bones to 2 rows of little square bones to these long phalanges. These are homologous structures. They are the same in all of these organisms. Just another picture. This one, same thing. We have a whale, a bat, a human, and a cat. So just so that in case you didn't like that other picture, humerus with the ulna, the radius, the carpals, and the metacarpals. And notice they are the same in all 4 of these. These are homologous structures. They are evidence that at one time we did have a common ancestor. Okay. The next thing that we can see are vestigial structures. Now, vestigial structures are structures that we have, but they either don't have a purpose or they have a very reduced function, and that organism could probably actually live without it. These show what we used to have and what used to work. So when we look at different vestigial structures, we can see these in several organisms, humans included. In this case, here's a whale. And when we actually look inside of a whale, they have a pelvis with a femur that is actually set up very similar to ours. Now, the last time I checked, whales don't need a pelvis or a femur because they're completely aquatic animals, but this gives us the question, why do they have a pelvis? Why do they have a femur if they didn't used to need them? Those are vestigial structures. Okay, here's another one. This is in a snake. When you look on the bottom of a snake, they actually have little hind limbs. They have little claws that stick out. And when you look at them, they have, here's their little claws. Here's a femur. Here's the ilium, which is a part of the pelvis. So once again, why do snakes have a femur? Why do they have a pelvis if they don't need them? Now, currently, remember, vestigial is no function or a very reduced function from what it used to be. These external limbs that you see in snakes, the males actually use them when to grab onto the females during mating. So they do have a function, it's just a very reduced function. Here's another vestigial structure. This one is in humans. This is our appendix. Now, our appendix in humans, it doesn't do anything. Its job is it collects bacteria. You can get an inflammation of your appendix, so you get appendicitis, so we have to have surgery. But when we look at other herbivores, they have very enlarged appendices, and these are the way they're supposed to be. Notice these pink shapes. They're very, very large. Now, in a herbivore, the appendix has a specialized enzyme called cellulase, and its job is to break down cellulose, which is the main component of plants, which makes sense because herbivores, if you remember from first semester, only eat plants, and so they need to be able to get as much nutrients out of that plant material as possible, and the appendix allows them to do that. Because we're omnivores, we don't solely rely on plants for our food source. Our appendix has become virtually useless. So those are vestigial structures, structures that no longer have a function, or they have a very reduced function. And we have a couple more in humans. We'll see if you can figure those out later. The last thing in comparative anatomy that I want to talk about are analogous structures. Now, analogous structures have the same function, but they're made up differently. They have a different internal makeup. This is indicative that there was not a common ancestor. So structurally they are different, but on the outside they look very similar to each other. So wings are an analogous structure. We have a moth, we have a bird, we have a butterfly, we have a bat. All of them have figured out ways to fly. Those are analogous structures. But internally, when you look at them, they look different. Remember, a bat we saw that with homologous structures. They have the same arm structure that we do. Birds are going to be a little bit differently. Butterflies and moths don't have any bones, so their wings are made up of differently. So homologous structures, they may or may not have the same function, but the structure is the same. Analogous, the function is the same, but the structure is different. Alright, so our next piece of evidence for evolution, piece number 3, are embryonic development. Now, when we look at vertebrates, all of our embryos are the same. This is highly suggestive that all vertebrates evolved from a shared ancestor. If we didn't have some similarities with each other, why would we all look the same? So, I'm going to give you a couple embryos here. Now, in there we have a human, we have a pig, a sheep, a salamander, a duck. But notice, when we look at their embryos, you can't tell. Now, we can see their similarities, and I'm sure if you're an embryologist, you could pick out the different similarities. But I can tell that this one is a little skinnier up around the head than this one on the far right. But we look pretty much the same. As we follow embryonic development on, we start to see a couple differences. We can probably figure out that this is the fish and the salamander. But we have a human, we have a turtle, we have a pig, I think we have a sheep. All of these are still relatively close to each other. How can we pick out the human in this group? We're all vertebrates. We all have to develop, we all have tails. We develop a vertebrate. We have our head. We start to see little hand nubs coming out. We start to see the development of feet. And this is actually going to become our tailbone down here at the end. So we all look very similar once we start to develop our 2 arms and our 2 legs. Continue on with our development. We can start to see a little bit more clearly where the turtle is, where the duck is, or the chicken. But we still have a pig, a sheep, a human. It's still pretty hard to tell who is who. I'm going to probably assume that this one right here is not the human. But once again, this is what we all started looking at way back when we were an embryo, so not very far into our being. We all look similar as we're developing those things that say we are a vertebrate. And as we continue on, here we go, we see we have a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, sorry, not a duck, a pig, a cow, a rabbit, and a human. Stuff that we're all very familiar with. We all know what they look like in their adult form, but embryonically, we all look very, very similar to each other. So that's another piece of evidence. If we weren't related to each other, why would we all look the same? Hey, our 4th piece of evidence for evolution is DNA similarities, or comparative biochemistry. And we talked about this when we watched The Code of Life earlier this semester. We have 99.9%, it's not 100%, but we have a lot of our DNA that's in common with other humans. We're very similar to each other. If you think about it, really, the only things that make us different are a couple of genes that determine hair color, eye color, skin color, height, rolling your tongue, not rolling your tongue. But for the most part, we have to be similar, or otherwise we wouldn't be a human. We share 98% with a chimpanzee. That's our next closest living or relative in terms of how much DNA we have in common with them. And then down here, a yeast, 26% in common with the yeast. Okay? Anything that makes you a cell, you have to have in common. So the idea that you have a ribosome and that you do transcription and translation and that you go through meiosis so that you can do sexual reproduction, the idea that you have to have a plasma membrane with transport proteins, everything that we talked about in being important for a cell, the DNA that tells you how to do that, all organisms have to have that in common. So if you're going to be a eukaryote, a multicellular organism, you have to have all of that DNA in common with all other eukaryotes that are out there, all other organisms that are multicellular. So how much DNA you share, that tells us how close and how common we are with each other. Now, one way that they do determine new species is that as you get more DNA that is not similar to other organisms, then you can start to be classified as a new species. But DNA similarities is one piece of evidence for evolution. And the last piece of evidence that we have, here's some recent changes. Let's skip this. The 5th piece of evidence that we have is geographic distribution. Now, when Darwin was looking at plants and animals on his trip through South America, he noticed that there are similar animals between South America and what you see in Europe. But what he did notice is that if they were from South America, they would have more things in common with other animals from South America than they would from their counterparts. So even though there was an animal that would occupy the same niche between South America and Europe, the South American animals had more in common with each other than they had in common with the European animals. What that tells us is that while there might have been a common ancestor there, once those animals were split, so some were in Europe, some were in South America, that they continued to change, they continued to evolve, until you get to where they are now, where we do have certain species that are in South America. We have a certain species that is in Europe, but they do retain some of their similarities. If you notice on this screen, we have a mara and a rabbit. The mara is the cousin to the rabbit. The mara is found in South America. The rabbit is an English rabbit. And they occupy the same niche. They're herbivores. They behave similar. They have similar reproductive styles. But they have their own look based on which continent they're on. So that's geographic distribution. If plants and animals that are in the same area are going to have more in common with each other than their counterpart in a different area. So what has this led to? Well, at the heart of Darwin's theory of evolution, we have all the pieces of evolution, but really it's adaptation. Adaptation is something that allows an organism to better survive its environment. How fit is it? And we have a couple of different adaptations that we know about. The first one is mimicry. We saw this a lot when we watched Planet Earth back in the fall. Mimicry is copying the appearance of another species. Okay? The second thing that we know is an adaptation is camouflage, how we blend in with our surroundings. Humans do this when we go into combat. We have camo greens, we have the tan and the brown camo. If they're in a snowy environment, they wear white camo. And we're not going to go into the desert wearing green camouflage. We want to blend in with the environment. Well, we're not the first ones to come up with that. Animals have been doing that for a long time. And the last one is a physiological adaptation. We see this a lot in bacteria. We have methicillin-resistant Staph aureus that is around. 10 years ago we didn't have that. It has become resistant to methicillin, which was the drug of choice for the Staph aureus bug. And now, if you get an MRSA infection, if you're elderly, it can be actually quite dangerous because we don't have any antibiotics that can kill these bacteria because they physiologically changed how they interact with those antibiotics and they're no longer killed by them. So here's an example of mimicry to snakes. Now personally, if I see a snake, I'm going the other way. I'm not going to pay attention. But birds, same thing. They're going to look and see a snake. And depending on the coloration, we know that one is dangerous and one is not dangerous. Once again, if I see a snake, I'm walking the other way. I'm not going to sit there and try to remember my saying of which one is deadly or which one isn't deadly. So the good snake is mimicking the bad snake in the hope that the predators just stay away because it's close enough to the one that's dangerous. Okay, here's camouflage. This guy's really hard to see in there. Once again, if you're a bird flying over, you're probably not going to pick him up. He does a very good job of blending in with his surroundings. And then here's our antibiotic resistance. Normally we would have all of these bacteria in here. We add our antibiotic. All the green ones get killed. The purple ones don't. Then the purple ones can reproduce. And now we're going to have a whole colony of bacteria that aren't going to get killed with the antibiotic. So 3 things of ways that organisms have been able to adapt that it just gives us, it's not necessarily a piece of evidence for evolution, but it just one more thing that tells us that evolution is happening, those widespread changes that we see in a species over time. So let's look at some recent changes. Okay? Natural selection is when those changes happen in the environment. Nature is dictating basically what changes are going to occur. We're going to see an example of some peppered moths here in just a little bit. Artificial selection, this is what we've been doing. We do a lot of artificial selection. So here's our peppered moths. These were over in England. Normally, moths are this white color. And what happened during the Industrial Revolution is that the trees became darker because of all the soot from the coal, and the moths really stood out against that tree bark. Well, they were easy pickings for the birds. Those moths that had a tendency to be darker in color were able to blend in more. They weren't picked off by the birds, so that dark coloring was passed on. The darker the moth, the easier it was to survive, so you didn't get picked off. And over several generations of moth, we actually saw a change from this white colored moth to this dark colored moth. They were able to blend in with those trees a lot better. Now they decided to clean up the air, so what they saw is that the trees weren't as dark anymore. So you have these moths, those that had the lighter tendency, or the tendency to be lighter coloration, actually were the ones that were able to blend in more as the trees got lighter. And so we saw a switch back to this lighter color moth as the tree bark changed. Now remember, the organisms don't get to pick this. We have natural variations in color, just like humans have natural variation in skin color. You might not have the same skin pigment as your brother or your sister or your parents. Moths are the same way. So remember, the moths didn't get to pick whether they went light or dark. But based on natural selection, if you had the tendency to have a darker moth, they were able to survive as the trees got darker. And then as the trees lightened up, those that were on the lighter side, those were able to survive. So as those organisms survive, those are the genes that get passed on to the next generation. So natural selection. Well, artificial selection, we've been messing around with this. These are tangelos, so a tangerine and an orange, I believe. This is a nice, cute little Shar-Pei. All of these wrinkles are not good for the dog. This is a artificial selection. We have bred dogs to look in a certain way. That's human intervention. And then a more recent thing are hairless cats that we have bred for people that have allergies to cat dander, to cat fur. They now make a hairless cat so that you can have a pet and not have to worry about your allergies. So these are artificial things that humans are doing, that we're changing the species that are out there. So over this podcast, we have talked about the 5 pieces of evidence for evolution. We talked about the fossil record. We talked about comparative anatomy. We talked about comparative embryology. We looked at DNA similarities and geographic distribution. And then at the end, we talked about how really at the heart of everything is the different adaptations that organisms can have. They can have camouflage, they can have mimicry, and then that the antimicrobial resistance that we see in the bacterial world right now is ways that they're adapting in order to survive.